Would you like to explore how Jung links this hubris of reason to his later theories on collective psychology? In this section, C.G. Jung addresses the structural capacity of the human mind for fragmentation, a phenomenon he terms the dissociability of the psyche. This concept serves as a direct rebuttal to Wilhelm Wundt's philosophical objection that the unconscious could not possess volition, as Wundt believed that functions like perceiving The transition of psychology from a branch of speculative philosophy to a formal natural science is a central theme in Jung's historical review of the unconscious. Prior to the 17th century, the study of the soul was largely a subjective endeavor, dominated by theological doctrines and metaphysical assertions that lacked an empirical foundation. Jung credits Christian von Wolff with a pivotal shift in this trajectory by introducing the concept of empirical psychology. This move allowed the psyche to be examined as an object of observation rather than merely a subject of faith, though psychology struggled for a long period to achieve the same academic and scientific status as the established physical sciences. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the concept of the unconscious faced significant intellectual resistance from the leading figures of experimental psychology. Wilhelm Wundt, often considered the father of modern psychology, largely rejected the unconscious as a viable hypothetical construct, preferring to focus on the immediate contents of consciousness that could be measured and reported. This academic climate favored a psychology without a soul, where the mind was viewed as a series of conscious processes and sensory responses. Despite this dominant trend, thinkers like Fechner, Lipps, and Herbert began to theorize about a deeper layer of the psyche that remained hidden from the ego's view. The work of Theodor Lipps is particularly highlighted by Jung as providing the essential theoretical basis for the modern psychology of the unconscious. Lipps suggested that psychological events are not merely conscious phenomena but are rooted in underlying processes that influence behavior and emotion from beneath the surface of awareness. This insight paved the way for the exploration of how various psychological functions operate autonomously, independent of the individual's will or conscious intention. Jung notes that these early pioneers foretold the immense significance the unconscious would eventually hold in clinical and analytical practices. Even with these early precursors, the hypothesis of the unconscious remained a controversial and frequently dismissed idea for many decades. The resistance to acknowledging an autonomous part of the mind stemmed from a deep-seated rationalism that sought to keep the human intellect in a position of absolute control. Jung's historical perspective serves to show that the discovery of the unconscious was not a sudden accident of the Freudian era, but a slow, resisted maturation of thought. By understanding this lineage, one can better appreciate how the unconscious evolved from a philosophical soul into a dynamic, empirical reality. The inclusion of the unconscious as a formal psychological concept represents a radical shift in European intellectual history, one which C.G. Jung compares to the revolutionary discovery of radioactivity in the field of physics. By moving beyond the limitations of subliminal consciousness, a term first posited by Frederick Myers in 1886, psychology began to acknowledge a vast, hidden dimension of the human experience that operates outside the direct control of the ego. This shift was met with significant resistance from established academics like Wilhelm Wundt, whose objections Jung systematically rebuts. Jung argues that the rejection of the unconscious was an attempt to maintain a fragmented view of the human mind that favored measurable, conscious data over the complex, underlying reality of the psyche. Accepting the hypothesis of the unconscious fundamentally alters the theory of knowledge, suggesting that all human understanding is inherently incomplete. Because the repository of our knowledge, the psyche, is only partially accessible to consciousness, the absolute validity of conscious knowledge is profoundly undermined. This realization posed a greater threat to human intellectual certainty than even the most rigorous critical epistemology had previously managed. It suggests that our perceptions and logical conclusions are constantly influenced by autonomous psychological functions that reside in the darkness of the unconscious, steering our thoughts in ways we do not consciously intend or perceive. Jung provides a stern critique of the trajectory of German philosophy following Hegel's perceived victory over Kant, which he views as a dangerous departure from intellectual humility. By rebuking Kant's critique of reason, later philosophers attempted to reinstate a godlike sovereignty of the human spirit, a movement that Jung believes culminated in the psychological hubris of Nietzsche's Übermensch. This inflation of the conscious intellect and the denial of the shadow or the unconscious elements of the soul created a fertile ground for the catastrophic rise of Nazi Germany. To Jung, the refusal to acknowledge the limits of the human mind allowed for a collective psychosis where reason was hijacked by unacknowledged archetypal forces. Ultimately, Jung asserts that any philosophical statement that attempts to transgress the bounds of human reason is essentially anthropomorphic. Such statements possess no objective validity and should instead be viewed as unintentional psychology, reflections of the author's own internal psychic state rather than universal truths. By recognizing the unconscious, we are forced to adopt a more modest and realistic view of human capability. This historical and philosophical context emphasizes that the study of the unconscious is not merely a clinical necessity, but a vital safeguard against the destructive inflations of the human intellect. In this section, C.G. Jung addresses the structural capacity of the human mind for fragmentation, a phenomenon he terms the dissociability of the psyche. This concept serves as a direct rebuttal to Wilhelm Wundt's philosophical objection that the unconscious could not possess volition, as Wundt believed that functions like perceiving or acting required a single, unified, experiencing subject. Jung counters this by drawing upon clinical and psychiatric evidence, which demonstrates that the unity of consciousness is far more fragile than previously assumed. In this section, C.G. Jung addresses the structural capacity of the human mind for fragmentation, a phenomenon he terms the dissociability of the psyche. This concept serves as a direct rebuttal to Wilhelm Wundt's philosophical objection that the unconscious could not possess volition, as Wundt believed that functions like perceiving or acting required a single, unified, experiencing subject. Jung counters this by drawing upon clinical and psychiatric evidence, which demonstrates that the unity of consciousness is far more fragile than previously assumed. He argues that the psyche is not a monolithic entity but is instead capable of splitting into semi-autonomous components, allowing for the existence of unconscious processes that operate independently of the primary ego. This inherent dissociability accounts for what Jung describes as a secondary consciousness or a subliminal personality. This secondary layer consists of psychological functions and personality components that have become separated from the main ego, often due to the mechanisms of repression. However, Jung also identifies a second, more prospective category, contents that remain unconscious not because they were pushed away, but because they represent the seeds of future conscious development. These emergent elements are not yet understood by the rational mind and thus reside in the darkness of the unconscious until the individual is ready to integrate them. Image representing the fragmented layers of the psyche and the threshold of consciousness. To further clarify the boundaries of awareness, Jung compares consciousness to the physical sense modalities, noting that just as there are limits to what we can hear or see, there is a specific threshold for psychic perception. He introduces the term psychoid to designate those processes that exist at the extreme ends of the psychic scale, areas where the psychological begins to merge with the physiological or the organic. These psychoid processes are essentially beyond the reach of conscious will, representing the deepest, most reflexive layers of the human experience that nonetheless influence the overall balance of the individual's mental life. Ultimately, Jung concludes that the existence of the unconscious is not merely a philosophical postulation but an empirical hypothesis that must be verified through practice. He asserts that the validity of the unconscious can only be proven when its hidden contents are successfully brought into the light of consciousness, a process that is central to his method of analytical psychology. By acknowledging that the psyche can be shattered or divided, we gain a more accurate understanding of human complexity, moving away from the illusion of a perfectly unified and controlled intellect toward a more dynamic model of the soul. Would you like to examine how this concept In this section, C.G. Jung explores the delicate boundary between physiological instinct and the psychological will, seeking to define where the biological ends and the psyche proper begins. He acknowledges the pioneering contributions of Sigmund Freud, who established the vital link between repressed unconscious contents and biological instincts. However, Jung notes that because instincts are deeply rooted in physiology, Freud's model made it difficult to distinguish purely psychological processes from organic ones. To address this, Jung references Pierre Janet's division of the psyche into a partie inférieure, which is governed by compulsive instinctual drives, and a partie supérieure, which falls under the influence of the conscious will. The transition of energy from the lower realm of instinct to the upper realm of the will marks a significant transformation in how psychological functions operate. Jung suggests that as a function moves toward the upper limit of the psyche, it is emancipated from its rigid, instinctual form and becomes more flexible and subject to intentional direction. In this framework, the will is positioned as a mediator between two extremes. Instinct serves as the lower limit of the will, while the spirit represents its upper limit. This conceptualization views the psyche not merely as a byproduct of biology, but as a space where functions are freed from purely reactive, reflexive patterns. Jung defines the psyche proper as consisting of all those functions that can potentially be brought under the control of the conscious will. This definition, however, leads to a theoretical complexity, as the will itself is a phenomenon that resides exclusively within the field of consciousness. This realization brings the discussion back toward the traditional axiom that the psyche is identical to consciousness, a point of significant disagreement between Jung and Janet. While Janet's model helped categorize the layers of mental activity, Jung continues to grapple with the paradox of how an autonomous unconscious can exist if the psyche is defined by its relationship to the will. Ultimately, Jung's examination of instinct and will highlights the evolutionary struggle of the human mind to gain autonomy over its biological foundations. By identifying the will as the defining characteristic of the psyche proper, he emphasizes the importance of consciousness in the process of human development. This exploration serves as a precursor to his later work on the transformation of energy, suggesting that the goal of psychological growth is the gradual liberation of our mental processes from the blind dictates of instinctual necessity.
Okay, next we're going to be moving on to 190 on the nature of the psyche. 5. Conscious and unconscious in Jung. C.G. Collected Works. Carl Gustav Jung, Volume 8. Second edition, Princeton University. 1972. 588. Paragraph 184 through 190.